Hello and welcome back to FatbossTV. Today we're looking at Archimonde on the Hellfire Citadel on the 6.2 PTR.
So here is our end boss, and he is pretty goddamn cool. He's got some very neat mechanics, some old-timey mechanics where he's knocking you up and all that kind of good stuff, but it is a very, very cool encounter. It's a long one though.
Yeah, it is a long fight.
You've got 3 phases, and each phase kind of has like a extra part at the end for the last 15% of it, so there's quite a lot going on, and we do actually have some friends with us as well. You've got Yrel, Grommash, and Khadgar.
I don't know what they're doing here.
I don't really know lore.
Probably asked Novel.
Yeah, there's also Gul'dan portal. It's crazy as shit. But yeah, overall it's a very cool fight.
Now, as a quick disclaimer before we do go into any of the boss abilities, this is PTR footage. Of course, it's not an actual FatBoss guide. A guide will be coming out in the first week when these bosses are released. But the encounter itself does feel pretty complete, so it's very likely it will remain the same.
Now, as this fight is quite a long fight, it's probably best we go through phase by phase, and let's start off with phase 1. Now, an ability that your tanks will need to deal with is something called Death Brand. After a 2-second cast, this will deal a huge amount of shadow damage to your tank, so you will need to use some sort of active mitigation, and it will spawn an ad called a Hellfire Deathcaller. Now, these Deathcallers are an attackable mob that applies a stacking dot on the tank that will eventually get so big that it will pretty much one-shot them. They also do an ability called Shadow Blast that is kind of like a volley that goes on a couple of people that just deals some shadow damage and increases the amount of shadow damage that you'll take by 25% for 30 seconds, so just be aware that you'll be taking a little bit more shadow damage. Now, these Deathcallers really do need to die, otherwise your tanks will just eventually fall over. However, there is an ad that is even higher DPS priority called a Doomfire Spirit.
Now, when these ads spawn, they'll stand completely still right underneath the boss, and they'll start spawning fire lines towards a player that they're fixating. If you stand in this fire, it will do a large amount of damage to you and also apply a stacking dot. And this fire lasts pretty much all the way until late phase 3. And the main reason why it's so important to kill these off quickly is because the boss will actually move the fire using an ability called Allure of Flames. This just picks up all the fire spawned from the Doomfire Spirit and will relocate it on top of raid members. Now, of course, this isn't really much of a big deal at the beginning of the encounter because there isn't that much fire. Not enough Doomfire Spirits have existed. But towards the end of the fight, you're going to have so much fire, and when it does move, it will always land in very small clumps and then explode out and move very, very quickly. The way that we deal with this ability across the entire fight is that we just move between 2 different markers every single time Allure of Flames was cast. Now, this probably isn't the best strategy. Maybe going around the edge of the room instead would probably be better, but either way it worked for us on the PTR.
Now, the final ability you have to deal with in phase 1 is something called Shadow Burst. This will knock a player up in the air along with anyone within 8 yards of them. They will then fall to the ground and deal around 550k damage split evenly amongst all players hit. So the idea is that you be spread out so only one person gets knocked up, and then as soon as that person is knocked up, a couple of people go underneath them in kind of like the targeting circle where they were, and you catch them, to kind of split the damage evenly amongst all the players that were hit by it so they don't instantly die.
Now, once you've dealt with all those abilities and you've got the boss to around 85%, this is when you'll get your second part of phase 1. During this time, the boss will still keep all of his other abilities, but he'll gain an extra one called Desecrate. This will spawn pillars underneath him that will deal ticking damage to the entire raid. Now, these pillars can't be destroyed by players, however, Yrel will start to kill them. Each time Yrel destroys one of them, a couple of orbs will spray out of them, and if you run over them, you'll get a buff that makes you immune to shadow damage, and will also give you 30% increased movement speed for roughly 20 seconds. Now, the amount of shadow damage that's sort of going out on the raid doesn't really merit any raid members picking up these orbs apart from the tanks, because the tanks are obviously getting battered by these Deathcallers because of the stacking dot. And of course, if you're immune to shadow damage, well, you're not going to take any damage from that ability at all. So we just had our tanks pick them up and try and keep the buff up as much as they possibly could.
By doing this as well, it also means that you can completely focus damage on the Doomfire Spirits and the boss only, meaning that you're going to have less fire going into phase 2, and you can get into phase 2 even quicker, which is awesome.
Once the boss reaches around 70% health, this is when you'll transition into phase 2. Now, in phase 2, the boss will maintain a couple abilities from phase 1, one of them being Death Brand, so you will still have to deal with the Deathcallers, but you will no longer have the spirits that spawn the fire, so now you can just put all your DPS on dealing with Deathcallers. Allure of Flames is still here, and we continue just moving from one side to another each time it's cast. And as you can see at this point, there is so much fire, so it's really, really important that you move quickly. But one of the new abilities that's been added in this phase is something called Shackled Torment.
This is a debuff placed on 3 random players that will do ever-increasing ticking damage. Now, you can remove the debuff by running 30 yards away from your initial location. It's kind of marked with a soul there that has a chain on you and all this kind of random stuff. But when you do run 30 yards away and remove the debuff, you'll deal a burst of damage to the entire raid. So when this ability comes in, you do want the 3 players to remove their debuff, but in a staggered way, to avoid bursting the raid down all at once. We just had a healer call out who should break their chain and when, so we didn't have like any confusion of who's breaking it, and we didn't all explode and die.
And the other thing that's been added in this phase is Wrought Chaos and Focus Chaos. Now these are 5-second debuffs that apply to random players, and all it will do is that once that debuff has ran out, it will put a beam of fire between those 2 players that just deals a load of fire damage. Every time these pair of debuffs come in, they actually have a stack that slowly goes down each time the beam is spawned, and it will continue just to jump until the stacks have disappeared. So the way that we dealt with this mechanic is that we just had the majority of the raiders sort of stacked underneath the boss anyway, because there's no reason not to be. And every time someone received the debuffs, they moved out the raid, spawned the beam of fire, and then moved back in. So if you ever did Radin in Throne of Thunder, it's a very similar premise to that. Just make sure you react quickly, and then your raid won't be barbecued.
So for this phase, you just continue to move side to side with the Allure of Flames, or however you want to deal with that mechanic. You kill off the Death Caller while breaking your shackles in a staggered manner and moving out with the Raw and Focus Chaos. You do this until about 55% when the boss will go into his second part of phase 2. Now for the next 15%, there will be 2 different types of ads that spawn from the portal at the back of the room, you know, the big green one that Gul'dan's like kind of casting on, and they'll come in the same set every single time. You'll have 1 Overfiend and 3 Dreadstalkers. Now the Overfiends don't really do anything, they just melee hit the tank, but each time their health is reduced by 25%, they'll do a burst of AoE to the raid. Now this didn't really seem to matter much, but I imagine if you chain this with like Shackled Torments or maybe a misplaced Wrought Chaos, then it could cause some issues. Just make sure you just don't nuke this guy down too quickly, just kind of passively cleave him down. The 3 Dreadstalkers also kind of just melee hit the tank, but they have an ability called Consume Magic. This will teleport them on top of a player, and after a short cast, they'll do some shadow damage and an AoE circle around them, and they will also interrupt anyone that is hit by this ability. These Dreadstalkers didn't really have much health again, and they could, you know, just be AoE'd or cleaved down quite easily.
Yeah, it wasn't really a big deal at all, really.
No, you just kind of move if there's like a shadow circle underneath you and just cleave them down. And really this kind of intermission phase between 55% and 40%, it's not very difficult at all. Just make sure you continue to focus down the Death Callers in comparison to all the other ads. That was a little bit of an issue for us. And just continue to move from all the other abilities.
Once you manage to get the boss to around 40%, this is when the fight gets a little bit more interesting, thankfully, and you will go into phase 3. In this phase, he'll no longer do his Deathbrand ability, which means you don't have to deal with the Death Callers anymore. He will no longer spawn any of the Fiends or any of that shit from the portal, and he'll no longer do his Allure of Flames, so you don't need to worry about moving very quickly from the fire anymore. The boss will maintain the Shackled Torment ability, where you need to break your chains in a staggered fashion, and he'll still do Wrought Chaos, so again, you need to make sure that you're keeping an eye on your debuffs.
One of the new mechanics in phase 3 is something called Demonic Feedback. This just deals shadow damage to each individual player in the raid, as well as an additional amount of shadow damage to anyone within 6 yards, so this means you need to be spread now, because if you're stacked up, you instantly die. This can cause some difficulties in dealing with the Wrought Chaos, as bouncing it around might need a little bit more coordination, because your whole raid isn't just stacked under, so it's easy to see where it is, as well as it might make breaking the Shackled Torments a little bit shit, because you might break it at the same time a Demonic Feedback comes in, and you might be comboed, but if it gets a bit sketchy at points, just manage your healing CDs carefully, and I imagine with timers you'll be absolutely fine.
Another ability that's been added in this phase is something called Never Banish. Now this is a tank debuff that lasts for 5 seconds, and after it expires it will drag the tank and anyone within 30 yards into the Twisting Nether. Now before we talk about the Twisting Nether, it will also leave a giant pool of shit in the main room, and this pool will spawn living shadows throughout the rest of the fight. Now living shadows are tankable ads that will just flat out explode whenever they reach their target, dealing a load of shadow damage to anyone nearby, as well as reducing the amount of healing that player receives by 20% for 45 seconds. These ads have very little health, so it is actually viable just to flat out kill them. However, you can just let them just go to random raid members through like random aggro and just die, and they can just soak them. We imagine probably the best way of dealing this is just having a group of ranged DPS being responsible to kill these ads, or even just have, like, I don't know, a third monk tank kite them around the room.
Yeah, kind of maybe similar to Siege of Orgrimmar, where you're kiting the ads on Garrosh, maybe. We're not 100% sure about these, but either way, they look like they're going to be something that you're definitely going to have to deal with. Of the players inside the Twisting Nether, which is a brand new room that you get teleported in with the Nether Banish, you have to kill an ad inside of there in order to get back to the main room. Now the ad inside there is called a Shadow Nether Caller, and all it does is something called Touch of Shadows. This is an interruptible cast, it will do shadow damage to everyone inside. Make sure you do interrupt it so you're just not going to be bursted down by all this damage. Another ad will also spawn inside the Twisting Nether that players need to deal with, called a Void Star. Now this ad will spawn on the edges of the room and fixate on the closest player and chase them. If it reaches the target, it will explode and knock you off the platform so quickly. It looks so hilarious. You go absolutely flying if this reaches you, and you're very, very likely just gonna die. Now you can slow this ad, and it doesn't really have much health, so just get a mobile range DPS such as a hunter or something, pick it up, slow it, and just kill it off. Now while players are in the nether, there will be circles on the ground that will do large AoE damage to you if you stand in them, so make sure you're not, but you'll also be taking constant ticking damage every 2 seconds. Now each time this deals damage to you, it will leave a debuff that increases the amount of damage you take from the ticking damage by 5% for 1 minute. Meaning that if you take too long to get out of the nether, you'll probably just die to the ticking damage inside. Now this debuff does remain on you after you leave the Twisting Nether as well, and it is likely that your debuff won't drop before the next tank gets put inside, meaning that you're probably going to have to organize 2 different sets of players to go inside. Now in order to deal with all of the mechanics in here, we decided having the one tank, because of course one tank has to go inside because they got the debuff on them, with a healer, and around 3 DPS was enough to deal with the ad in a good amount of time, whilst keeping the players up inside with the healer. Once the ad is dead, it will just spawn a portal. You right click on the portal and go back into the main room.
So just to highlight this phase 3, you need to make sure that you're spread 6 yards because of the AoE that's coming in. You need to make sure that you still do all the wrought chaos and of course with the shackle. And each time the tank gets the nether banish, you need to make sure that you have 1 healer and a couple of DPS stacked up on top of him so they go inside the Twisting Nether to deal with the ad. And for any players that are outside, you need to make sure that you just nuke down any living shadows that spawn from the portal or just soak them or whatever. Now when the boss hits 25%, this is when you'll get the last part of phase 3, and this time he is super fucking pissed.
Yeah, he's pretty goddamn angry.
He will cause several huge meteors to spawn from the sky and just slam on the ground, dealing massive damage to the entire raid. The further you are away from these impacts, however, the less damage you will take. Now some of these meteors will actually sort of reanimate and actually spawn Doombringers. Now, these Doombringers on live we can assume are going to be a real pain because they have like a passive ability that makes it that when they're stacked, they start healing each other for 8% of their maximum health each second. However, on PTR they had so little health.
They just melted.
Yeah, we just made all the DPS switch them, they just died super quick. These Infernals also have an energy bar that when it reaches maximum, it will just deal a massive amount of fire damage to all players within 40 yards every second. So the idea is, we assume, is that you sort of like, you get 1 tank to take all of them away from the raid apart from 1, and you just slowly taunt them over and just kill them off 1 by 1, and you have to do it within a certain amount of time, otherwise everyone's going to die from like this Hellfire AoE.
Yeah, or maybe it's very similar to, once again, the ads on Garrosh, where, you know, had 1 DPS deal with each of the Infernals, maybe, to keep them spread out, because of course your tank's going inside all the time with the nether banish, so it's a little bit, we'll have to see exactly how you do this on live servers, but on PTR, as we said, we just kind of stacked them and killed them because it wasn't really working properly.
But apart from that, that's everything you have to deal with. I mean, this last phase is just incredibly hectic.
Yeah, very hectic.
It's just all about, you know, bloodlust and nuking the boss before he kills you. I think we managed to get the boss to around 5%, I think, on our best attempt.
5%.
Something like that. It's a very good encounter. I like it, but while we were testing it, it did not feel like a last boss. That's my only complaint about this encounter, but I think one of the reasons behind that is that maybe it was slightly undertuned. Yeah,
the damage of the abilities were very, very forgiving, and I think that probably was for PTR testing purposes, so they could get more people to see more of the fight, so they could test things, especially with like the nether banish in the last phase and things like that. But it seems like you could fuck up quite a lot, and it's like, oh well, it don't matter. Yeah. Don't worry about it. And in comparison to things like Manaroth, which are really, really vicious, it seems that this boss is a little undertuned at the moment, but assuming that he is like kind of buffed up and made a little bit more savage, we should be fine. And yeah, it's going to be an awesome fight. I can't wait to play it on live.
That's pretty much all we got time for. If you did enjoy this little preview, then please do give us a like. It helps us out a lot. And if you'd like to see any of our other PTR previews, there is a link in the description. It'll take you straight to all those videos. And yeah, we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.